In the last week of December 1944, in a frozen Belgian town most Americans had never heard of, a surrounded general was handed a written demand for his surrender, and he answered it with a single word. One word, 5 letters, typed on a piece of paper and sent back across the lines to the German commander who had promised to annihilate him. It was not a strategic word. It was not a defiant speech or a stirring line written for the history books. It was a piece of American slang so casual, so offhand, that the German officers who received it could not understand what it meant and had to have it explained. And that one word became one of the most famous replies in the history of warfare, because it was sent at the exact moment when, by every rule of the situation, the man who sent it should have been raising a white flag instead. To understand why that word mattered, you have to understand how bad things were for the men who sent it. And to understand that, you have to go back to the 16th of December 1944, when the German army did something the Allies had convinced themselves it could no longer do. It attacked. By that winter, most people on the Allied side believed the war in Europe was effectively decided. Germany had been pushed back across France, its cities were being bombed to rubble, and the general feeling among American troops was that the hard part was over and the thing was winding down towards spring. Then, out of the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, along a quiet stretch of front that the Americans had left thinly held precisely because it seemed safe, the Germans launched a massive surprise offensive. It was Hitler's last great gamble in the West, codenamed Wache am Rhein, and its goal was breathtaking in its ambition: to punch through the American lines, race across Belgium, and seize the vital port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in two. The attack tore a huge bulge into the American front, which is why the whole battle would come to be known, forever after, as the Battle of the Bulge. And everything in that plan, the whole racing armored thrust to the west, depended on speed. The German panzers had to move fast, before the Americans could recover, before the skies cleared and Allied air power came back into play. Fast movement meant roads, and in that stretch of the Ardennes, roads meant one place above all others: Bastogne. Bastogne was not much of a town. It was a small, unremarkable place in the Belgian countryside, the kind of town you would drive through without noticing. But it had one feature that made it worth more than a city, and it was written into the map itself. 7 paved roads converged there, meeting at Bastogne like spokes at the hub of a wheel. For an army trying to move tanks and trucks and fuel through the tangled, forested, snowbound Ardennes, where vehicles could not simply drive cross-country, those roads were everything. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of an army. The Germans understood this perfectly. They knew that if they could take the crossroads, the way west was open, and if they could not, their entire timetable would begin to unravel. Bastogne had to fall, and it had to fall quickly. The Americans understood it too, and in a scramble, they threw the nearest force they could find into the town to hold it. That force was the 101st Airborne Division, the paratroopers known as the Screaming Eagles. The thing to understand about the 101st in December of 1944 is that they were in no shape for what was about to happen to them. They were not a fresh, fully equipped division moving into a prepared position. They had been pulled off the line and sent to rest and refit at Reims in France after months of hard fighting, and they were caught mid-rest when the emergency call came. They were rushed toward Bastogne at speed, piled into trucks, many of them without adequate winter clothing in one of the coldest European winters on record. They arrived short on ammunition, short on supplies, short on the heavy weapons they would need, moving up toward a town that the German army was converging on from multiple directions with tanks and artillery. Their acting commander was not even their usual division commander, who was back in the United States. The man in charge was his deputy, a Brigadier General named Anthony McAuliffe, who was about to find himself in one of the tightest spots any American commander faced in the entire war. Because the Germans moved fast, and the ring closed fast. Through the freezing days of late December, German forces pushed around Bastogne on every side, and by the 21st of December the town was completely surrounded. The 101st Airborne, along with the tank and artillery units that had joined them in the defense, were now cut off, encircled, with no ground line of supply and no way out. And the weather, which should have been their salvation, was instead their enemy. Thick fog and low clouds sat over the Ardennes, grounding the Allied aircraft that might have dropped them supplies or broken up the German attacks. No resupply, no air cover, freezing cold, dwindling ammunition, surrounded on all sides by a larger force. It was, in short, exactly the kind of situation in which a commander is expected to consider surrender, and the Germans, looking at that same situation from the outside, came to precisely that conclusion. They believed the men trapped in Bastogne could see the hopelessness of their position as clearly as anyone. So on the 22nd of December they decided to make it official. They drew up a formal demand, and they sent it under a white flag into the town, fully expecting that the trapped Americans would do the sensible thing. What they got back instead was that one word, and in the next part we read exactly what the Germans wrote, and exactly what McAuliffe sent in reply. The demand that came into Bastogne on the 22nd of December was not shouted across a battlefield or radioed in code. It arrived in the most formal way imaginable, which somehow made it more chilling. In the early afternoon, 4 German soldiers came walking up a road toward the American lines under a white flag. 2 officers and 2 enlisted men, one of them carrying the flag, one of them blindfolded and led along. They were met by American soldiers, and they announced that they were bearing a written message from the German commander to the American commander of the encircled town. They were carrying, in other words, a surrender ultimatum, typed out and signed, a document meant to be handed from one general to another according to the old rules of war. The message was taken back through the lines, and eventually it made its way to the command post where Brigadier General McAuliffe was operating. And here we can read what the Germans actually wrote, because the document survived, and its language tells you everything about how completely the German command believed it held the winning hand. The ultimatum was addressed to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. It opened by laying out the situation in cold, factual terms designed to remove any hope. The fortune of war, it said, was changing. The American forces in and around Bastogne had been encircled by strong German armored units. It went on to claim that more German forces had crossed the river and taken control of the area, and that there was, in the German phrasing, only one possibility to save the encircled troops from total annihilation: honorable surrender. The message gave the Americans a deadline, 2 hours, to think it over and reply. And then it delivered its threat, and the threat was the heart of the thing. If the Americans refused, the message said, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions stood ready to annihilate them. It warned that the resulting bombardment would not only destroy the American troops, but would cause serious losses among the civilian population still in the town. And it closed by declaring that all the suffering caused by this artillery fire would not correspond to the well-known American humanity. Read that again, because it is a masterpiece of a certain kind of pressure. It told the trapped men that they were surrounded, that they were outgunned, that annihilation was certain, and then, in its final move, it tried to make their deaths their own moral fault, suggesting that if they did not surrender, the blood of Belgian civilians would be on American hands. It was a demand for surrender dressed up as an appeal to conscience, and it was delivered by an army that fully expected it to work, because from the German point of view the math was simply not in dispute. The men in Bastogne were finished. Everyone could see it. Everyone, it turned out, except the men in Bastogne. When the message was translated and brought to McAuliffe, the accounts of the moment agree on the essential thing. He was not impressed. The demand for surrender struck him less as a serious threat than as an absurdity, and his first reaction, according to the men who were there, was a dismissive, almost irritated exclamation, the offhand American slang word that would become legendary. He is said to have muttered it as a throwaway reaction to the whole idea of surrendering, and then when it came time to actually compose a formal written reply to the German commander, he was reportedly at a loss for what to put on paper. It was one of his staff officers who pointed out that his very first reaction had been perfect, that nothing else needed to be said, and so McAuliffe had it typed up, exactly as he had said it, as the official response of the American commander to the German demand for his surrender. The reply, in full, read, "To the German commander, Newts, the American commander." That was the entire message, one word of content. A piece of American slang so casual it might be tossed off over a card game, sent back in answer to a formal, threatening, 2-hour ultimatum promising annihilation. And here the story produces its perfect final wrinkle, because the German officers who received the reply could not understand it. Nuts is idiomatic English. Translated literally into German, it means nothing at all, just a word about a food, and it carried none of the dismissive contempt that an American would hear in it instantly. The German envoys were genuinely baffled. They asked what it meant. Was it an affirmative reply or a negative one? And so it fell to an American officer, Colonel Joseph Harper, who escorted the German party back toward their lines. To translate the untranslatable, he explained to them in effect that the reply was decidedly not affirmative, and he put it in terms they could not miss. If they did not understand what nuts meant, he told them, it meant the same thing as go to hell, and he added, as they parted, that if the German attack continued, the Americans would kill every one of the men who tried to come into the town. The German officers saluted and went back to their lines and carried with them the strangest surrender reply in the war, a refusal so casual it had to be explained, from a garrison that by every reasonable measure had no business refusing anything. Now, it is worth pausing here to be precise about who was on the other side of that exchange, because this is exactly the kind of detail that legend tends to blur. The force besieging Bastogne, the army that sent that ultimatum, was not the Waffen-SS, whatever some retellings suggest. The ultimatum came through the German army's regular command. The corps commander in that sector was General Heinrich von Lüttwitz, operating under General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, and the divisions closing the ring around the town were Wehrmacht armored and Volksgrenadier formations, not SS units. The distinction matters because the honest version of this story does not need to reach for the most sinister label to make its point. The men who demanded Bastogne's surrender were professional soldiers of the regular German army, and they were not bluffing about the artillery. What they had underestimated was not their own firepower. It was the willingness of a cold, hungry, surrounded, undersupplied airborne division to simply refuse to accept the logic of their own defeat. Because the nuts reply was not bravado for its own sake. It was a bet. McAuliffe was wagering that his men could hold the crossroads long enough for the situation to change, long enough for the weather to break, for the air to clear, for help to fight its way through. In the next part, we find out whether that bet paid off and what it cost, as the German artillery made good on its promise and the siege reached its worst. The Germans did exactly what they said they would do. When the 2-hour deadline passed and the only answer was that single baffling word, the artillery opened up and the promise of annihilation stopped being a threat on paper and became the daily reality of life inside the ring. The shelling came in on the town and the foxholes around it, and there was nowhere to go, because the whole point of the situation was that there was no longer an outside. The men of the 101st and the tank and artillery units fighting alongside them were living in the frozen ground, in holes scraped out of earth so cold it had to be broken with picks. And the German guns searched that ground day after day. The conditions in those days are almost hard to take in. It was one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades, and the men holding Bastogne were, as we have seen, the men who had been rushed up from rest without their winter gear. They were fighting in ordinary field clothing, in sub-freezing cold, in snow, and the cold itself became an enemy as dangerous as the German army. Frostbite tore through the ranks. Men lost toes and feet to the freezing without a shot being fired at them. There was little to eat as the encirclement dragged on and the supplies that could not be replaced ran lower and lower, and the thing they needed most, above food, above even reinforcements, was ammunition, because you cannot hold a perimeter against tanks if your guns fall silent, and the artillery inside Bastogne was rationing its shells so tightly that gunners were at times told how few rounds they were permitted to fire and against what. This was the crux of the whole bet McAuliffe had made. The defense of Bastogne was not a matter of driving the Germans off. The garrison did not have the strength for that. It was a matter of holding on, of keeping the ring from breaking inward, of making the crossroads too costly and too contested for the Germans to use, hour after hour, day after day, while praying that something would change before the ammunition or the men ran out. It was a siege in the oldest sense, and the defenders' only real weapon was refusal, the same refusal that the word nuts had announced. And what makes the endurance of it more remarkable is the very thing we established about the enemy. The German force around Bastogne was not a second-rate formation. It was professional Wehrmacht armor and grenadiers, well led, attacking a surrounded and undersupplied opponent, the exact situation in which a besieged force is supposed to crack. The Germans probed and attacked the perimeter from different directions, looking for the weak seam that would let them collapse the whole defense. They found the paratroopers and the tankers holding and holding and holding in weather that was killing men on both sides, around a town that the Germans needed and could not have. The one thing that could save Bastogne was the one thing the weather kept taking away: the sky. As long as the fog and low cloud sat over the Ardennes, the enormous Allied advantage in air power was worth nothing. No fighters could come down to break up the German attacks. No transport planes could fly over the town to drop the ammunition and supplies the garrison was starving for. The men in Bastogne needed the clouds to lift almost as badly as they needed the Germans to stop coming. And then, around the 23rd of December, the weather broke. The skies over the Ardennes cleared, and everything that air power could do, it now did. Transport planes flew over the encircled town and dropped supplies by parachute to the defenders below: ammunition, medical supplies, the things that let a garrison keep fighting. Allied fighter bombers came down out of the newly clear sky and went to work on the German forces around the town, on the artillery and the armor and the supply lines that the fog had protected. The clearing of the weather did not end the siege by itself, but it changed the arithmetic completely. The defenders who had been rationing their shells could fight again. The Germans who had been hammering the perimeter now had to do it while being hammered themselves from above. But air power alone could not lift a siege. Bastogne was still surrounded on the ground, and to actually break the ring, someone had to fight their way in overland, through the German forces, from the outside. And someone was already trying. To the south, one of the most famous American commanders of the war had wheeled an entire army toward Bastogne with a speed that his own staff had thought impossible. General George Patton's Third Army, fighting elsewhere when the German offensive erupted, had been ordered to disengage, turn 90 degrees, and drive north into the flank of the Bulge to relieve the trapped town, a maneuver of enormous logistical difficulty in winter conditions, moving tens of thousands of men and their vehicles across icy roads under brutal pressure of time. Patton had promised he could do it far faster than anyone expected, and now his lead formation, the 4th Armored Division, was grinding north toward Bastogne, fighting through German resistance the whole way, trying to punch a corridor through to the men holding the crossroads. For the defenders inside, these were the days when everything hung in the balance at once. The air was finally on their side. Help was fighting toward them from the south. But the Germans, knowing relief was coming, threw themselves at the perimeter with greater urgency, trying to take the town before Patton could reach it. The siege reached its most violent pitch in exactly the stretch when rescue was closest, which is the cruel rhythm of these things, the storm worst just before it breaks. On the 26th of December, 1944, the lead tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division fought through the last of the German resistance and broke into Bastogne, opening a corridor to the outside world. The ring was broken. The garrison that had answered a demand for its annihilation with a single dismissive word had held the crossroads through the shelling, the cold, the hunger, and the assaults, long enough for the sky to clear and the relief to arrive. The bet had paid off. In the final part, we look at what that stand actually cost, why the men who made it bristled at the word rescued, and what the German commanders themselves came to understand about the crossroads they could not take. The relief of Bastogne on the 26th of December did not end the fighting, and this is the first thing that gets lost when the story is compressed into its famous punchline. Patton's tanks had punched a narrow corridor into the town, but a corridor is not the same as safety, and the Germans spent the following days trying to pinch it closed again. The battle in and around Bastogne went on into January, and some of the hardest fighting the 101st did there came after the moment everyone remembers as the rescue. The cold went on killing, the artillery went on falling. The victory, like most real victories, did not arrive as a single triumphant instant, but as a slow, grinding confirmation that the worst had passed, and it had cost a great deal. The precise casualty figures depend on how you draw the lines around the battle, whether you count only Bastogne or the whole vast Battle of the Bulge, which was one of the bloodiest engagements the American army fought in the entire war. But the human cost of the stand at the crossroads was heavy, in men killed and wounded by the shelling and the assaults, and in the quieter toll of the cold, the men who lost feet and hands and health to frostbite in those frozen foxholes. The single word had been easy to send. The thing it committed those men to was not easy at all, and a great many of them paid for it in ways that lasted the rest of their lives. Any honest telling of Bastogne has to hold those two facts together. The reply was magnificent, and it was also a promise written in other men's suffering. There is a detail about the aftermath that tells you a great deal about the men who held the town, and it concerns that very word, rescued. In the years afterward, as the story became famous and the relief by Patton's army became part of the legend, many of the veterans of the 101st Airborne bristled at the idea that they had been rescued at all. Their position, stated with the particular stubbornness of proud infantry, was that they had never needed rescuing. They had been surrounded, yes, and low on everything, yes, but they had been holding, and they intended to go on holding, and Patton's arrival had opened the road but had not saved them from a defeat that, in their own minds, was never going to happen. The 101st, the saying went, had never been relieved because the 101st had never been in danger of losing. Whether or not that is entirely fair to the desperate reality of the siege, it captures something true about the spirit that produced the word nuts in the first place. These were men who simply refused, at a level below strategy, to accept that they were beaten. And what of the other side, the German commanders who had sent the ultimatum, so certain of the outcome? This is where the honest version of the story finds its real ending, and it does not need any invented quotes to land it, because the record is clear enough on its own. The German plan for the entire Ardennes offensive had depended on speed, on racing to the west before the Americans could recover. Bastogne, the crossroads that had to fall quickly, did not fall quickly, it did not fall at all. And the days that the 101st and the units alongside them bought by holding it, the days the Germans spent surrounding, shelling, demanding and assaulting a town they could not take, were days the German timetable could not afford to lose. The delay at Bastogne was one of the threads that, when pulled, helped unravel the whole offensive. The German generals who wrote about the campaign afterward understood this. The crossroads they had been so confident of taking became one of the places where their last great gamble in the West came apart. That is the weight the single word carried in the end. Nuts is remembered because it is funny, because it is so perfectly, casually American, because there is a deep satisfaction in a surrounded man answering a threat of annihilation with a shrug and a piece of slang. But it was not really a joke, and it was not really about one man's wit. It was the compression into 5 letters of a decision that thousands of cold and hungry men then had to make real with their bodies over the days that followed. The decision to hold a patch of frozen Belgian ground because holding it mattered more than the near certainty that holding it would hurt. The word was the easy part. The men made it true. The country sends its soldiers to places whose names it will later struggle to remember, and asks them to do things that get flattened, over time, into a line in a textbook or a single famous word. Bastogne became nuts, the way a whole siege can shrink into an anecdote. But underneath the anecdote is the real thing, a broken-down, under-equipped airborne division thrown into a crossroads town in the worst winter in memory, surrounded by a professional army that told them to surrender or die, and a general who answered for all of them with the most offhand refusal in the English language, and then a division that spent a freezing week proving he had meant it. The Germans asked Bastogne to see reason. Bastogne sent back one word, and the word held, because the men behind it did.